Hey everybody, I'm going to show you how to play a relatively simple version of a solo guitar arrangement of Silent Night. This is one of my favorite Christmas tunes, and this is a pretty cool approach to it. I think it's pretty accessible to anybody who's a beginner, intermediate, or advanced guitar player. The song is going to focus really on the right hand and how to use the right hand to highlight melody notes in the chords that we're playing. I'm going to break this arrangement down into three parts: the beginning, the middle, and the end. So part one is going to be the beginning, part two is going to be the middle, and part three is the end of the song. So with that being said, let's get into part one. So let's take a look at part one. Like I mentioned before, this arrangement really has to do with how to highlight the melody with the right hand. So when you're strumming these chords, you're not going to be strumming the complete voicing of the chord. You're just going to be strumming parts of the voicing. And that's really the trickiest part of this guitar arrangement. So in part one, let's check out what that sounds like. So this first part is going to start with the open C major chord, but I'm not going to play the entire voicing. I'm just going to play the first three notes of the chord. That chord is going to start with the ring finger on the third fret of the A string and my middle finger on the second fret of the D string and the open G. So I'm going to play those three strings at once, take my middle finger off, put it over to the second fret of the G string, play that, take my middle finger off, play the open G, and go back to the A and D strings and just play those two together. So that little passage looks like this. Middle finger off, and then back and playing just the A and D strings together. Now after we repeat that twice, we're going to the G major chord. Now, in the chart that I wrote this chord out omitting my first finger. This is just a traditional open G major chord, and you can play it with your first finger or without. I like to kind of do a lazier version of this voicing, so I take my first finger off this chord. But similarly to the C major chord, we're just going to be strumming this chord from the lowest note to the B string, to our ring finger on the third fret of the B string. Once we strum that note with the chord, we're going to pick it by itself. And that sounds like this. And after we do that, we're going to take our ring finger off this chord and play the chord with the open B string. So altogether, it sounds like this. After we play that, we're going to go back to the open C major chord, and we're going to strum it, but only to the B string, to where our first finger is on the first fret of the B string. We're going to play the chord, and then that string by itself, and then the first three notes of the chord, just like in the beginning of the song. In total, it sounds like this. So this whole first part goes like this. So that's part one. So now let's take a look at part two. This is going to start with an F major chord. And instead of playing, because F major chords are typically kind of a pain because you have to bar it with your first finger and play these two notes at the same time with this first finger, instead of doing that, we're just going to play the first three notes of this chord, which is the third fret of the D string, second fret of the G string, first fret of the B string. Now, similarly to the other chords in part one, we're just going to play the first two notes of this chord, the D and the G string. We're going to play those together, and then we're going to play the G string by itself. After we play that, we're going to play the B and the G string by themselves. This is a cool right hand little trick. It's simple, but it's not totally easy to do. After you play the G and the B strings together, the upper half of this F major chord, you're going to play the G and the B strings open by themselves, and then put your middle finger down on the 2nd fret of the G string. And then you're going to go back to the beginning of the song. And you're going to repeat this whole thing twice. Now, if you're used to it, it's nice to be able to use, if you're using a pick, using your middle and 3rd fingers to pluck these pairs of strings. Sometimes when we use a pick and we only want to strum 2 strings, it can be a little tricky to not strum more than 2 strings. So it's nice to just sometimes pinch the pairs of strings like this. It takes a little getting used to, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes a really useful tool for being specific with your chords. So in total, part 1 and 2 together sound like this. So now let's take a look at part 3. Part 3 is going to start with a G chord, and it's the same G chord that we were using to play in the first part. We're going to strum that chord until we get to the B string, and we're going to play that B string again afterward. So that sounds like this. And after we play that, we take our first finger and we stick it up on the 1st fret of our high E string. And I strum the whole chord with the 1st finger on the high E string. Once you play that, pick your B string on the 3rd fret and then strum it without your ring finger on the 3rd fret. So you get that open B string, and then play A minor to the same B string on the 1st fret. So that whole thing sounds like this. When you get to the A minor chord, like I said, you're strumming it just to the B string. Careful not to hit the high E string, because that's what comes next. You play it to the B string, and then you play the high E string by itself. And then the very end of the song is this little descending melody that starts with the C major chord. You strum the C major chord from the bass note to the B string, and then pick the open G, the 2nd fret of the D. So you're walking backwards from the chord. Put your middle finger on the low E string and pluck that with the open G. Put your ring finger on the 3rd fret of the D, the open D, and then it goes back to C major. So that whole last part goes. I like to add that low E string on the 3rd fret to that C chord. And it's like an E major chord, but just the 3rd fret of my low E, 3rd fret of my A, and the 2nd fret of my D string. And that kind of gives you that low C resolve instead of playing the high C. So the entire piece, all put together, sounds like this.